So here we are at topic 8, evolution, and let's begin. So evolution is the gradual change in a species over time. And so the modern theory of evolution came about by lots of different scientists, but we credit Charles Darwin with the majority of it. He was not the first to think of evolution, but he did figure out how it works for the most part. What he didn't know was he didn't know anything about genes and mutations and how they get passed on. So he couldn't account for some of the variety or the variances in evolution, but he had a pretty strong idea. So the modern theory, which combines Darwin's ideas with genetics and other new ideas, contain the following ideas. So this is everything combined. Number one, Earth is old. It's very, very old. 4.5 billion years old, and it's constantly changing. This is something that we know. Number two that we know, as the environment changes, evolution selects species that are best adapted to their environment. So species don't just change to become better in their environment. They're born with these adaptations that allow them to survive in a different environment. And then number three, natural selection is the mechanism that causes species to change. The best fit are the ones that survive. Then we have common descent, this idea that modern species have evolved from earlier different species and share a common ancestor. Number five, species that cannot adapt become extinct. As we know, like with the dinosaurs, they just were not adapted for how the world changed, so they went extinct after a period of time. And number six, new traits arise in a species from mutations and sexual reproduction. The environment and evolution. Species usually evolve when the environment changes. Changes need to be long-term. Species do not evolve because of the change in season or because there was a storm. This is like years and years, many years of changes. Changes can include things like climate change, so that's over a long period of time. You know how they're talking about global warming right now. Well, they think that because of global warming, it's been occurring for a long time, species are going to go extinct. Or maybe some can evolve. Two, changes in temperature, overall world temperatures. Three, change in water availability, if there's like an excess of water or not enough water. Four, a change in food availability. Five, introduction of new species, which means either new food or a new predator, or just something to compete with. Number six, species may be moved to a new location. For example, accidentally taken to an island, like the Darwin's finches. They were somehow blown, probably by a storm, to the Galapagos Islands, and they had a brand new environment there, and they evolved. Okay, so environmental change does not cause evolution to occur, and it's in caps because it doesn't force evolution to occur, but it does allow for new adaptations to become stronger, essentially. A temperature or climate change does not in itself force a species to change its inherited characteristics. If this were the case, then all species would be able to adapt to the new environment, and extinction would be a very rare event. Okay, more on natural selection. The basic steps of natural selection are, first, we have to have variation. Members of a species are different from each other due to mutations and sexual reproduction. If there's no variation, then you're not going to see any evolution or natural selection because there's nothing to select for. If everybody's the same, nobody's stronger or more fit than another, they're all going to have equal survivability. Species with no variation are usually the first to die when the environment changes. Then we have to have overproduction in species. Too many offspring are going to be produced because that way the ones with the better variations are going to be more likely to survive. And that's where competition comes in. The offspring have to struggle to survive and reproduce. And we have adaptations. The offspring who inherited the fit traits are, on average, better able to get resources, escape from predators, and find mates. And then the offspring with the unfit traits will have more difficulty surviving and finding mates. Okay, then we have fitness. This is a measure of how well a trait helps an organism to survive and reproduce in its environment. Note, there's no absolute rule for fitness because what is fit in one environment may be unfit for another. Note, this selection is not a conscious act. There's no person or no thing that's choosing to survive or who survives and who doesn't. It's a result of the conditions of the organism's environment. If the conditions are such that that organism has an adaptation that allows them to survive, then they will survive and pass those better traits on. So then we move on to the term survival of the fittest. The more fit organisms will reproduce, pass on their genes than the unfit organisms. And on average, the next generation will have more traits from the fit parents than the unfit ones. Another note here, traits are still inherited randomly. Individual offspring of fit parents can still inherit the unfit traits, though it'll be unlikely to survive and reproduce. It is only by looking at the entire population that you'll see the fit traits become more common. And then we also know that evolution is gradual. It does not happen overnight. It takes many generations of repetitive selection to weed out the unfit traits. Then we have speciation. This is the process of making a new species from an existing one. You can do this, this happens in multiple ways. And some of these ways can overlap with each other. You can have geographic isolation. This is when a population is separated into two or more different habitats. You're going to see new variation and adaptations. Each population adapts to its new environment in different ways. This results in physical and genetic differences between the two populations. And they're not talking about just one generation. This is over multiple generations. Then you add time, and the longer the two populations are apart, the greater their differences will become. And then you have reproductive isolation. Eventually the populations change so much that they are unable to interbreed even when they're brought back together. And once two populations can no longer breed together, they're considered a new species. Okay, so now classification goes along with evolution because we're trying to find out how organisms that are alive today are related to extinct organisms. And this is our way of classifying everything and finding out their relationships. So organisms are classified based on their evolutionary relationships. And we did learn that domains are the biggest grouping. They're the most broad. And then we have kingdoms. These are going to be large groups of related organisms. The kingdoms are fungi, bacteria, protists, animals, and plants. And then it goes kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So then we get down to species. This is very specific. And a species is able to successfully reproduce amongst its members. This is not a perfect definition, though, because lions and tigers can breed together, so can dogs and wolves. Because evolution is constantly ongoing and a gradual process, there's many examples where the lines between species are blurry. But usually species have very specific traits that help you to identify them as separate species. And if you think about it, lions and tigers in nature would never mate because they don't live in the same area. They don't live in the same habitats. So we only know that they can mate because they've been in the same zoo or captivity environment, and that's how we've discovered that. Okay, and now moving on to branching tree diagrams or cladograms. They're often used to show evolutionary relationships between organisms. And then evidence of evolution. It comes from many fields. We look at the fossil record, and these are preserves, or the fossil record preserves extinct species as well as transitional forms between different types of organisms. And then we have radiometric dating or radioactive dating of rocks. That consistently confirms the age of the Earth and fossils. That's how we know how old the Earth is. Then we have comparisons of the anatomy, like the physical structures, looking at the limbs. Remember the forelimbs of all those different species and how they're similar. Then we have embryology, which is how organisms develop as they're growing as an embryo. the chemistry and genes of species. We compare their DNA and their proteins with each other. And this all confirms their expected relationships. Once in a while, scientists find a surprise, and then they have to reorganize the evolutionary tree relating to how organisms, which ancestors they share and how they're related to each other. And then we have direct observation. Humans have seen evolution occur both in nature and in the lab. For example, bacteria. Bacteria, because they can reproduce so quickly and produce many generations in a short period of time, you can see evolution occur right in front of your eyes, essentially, because bacteria can evolve resistance to antibiotics. And the way that happens is you have a population of bacteria. And those bacteria, even though they reproduce by asexual reproduction, they can still have mutations that randomly occur in their DNA or their RNA. And so maybe one of those mutations allows a few bacteria to be resistant to a certain antibiotic. Well, if that whole population of bacteria are exposed to an antibiotic, only the ones with that mutation are going to survive. So then those are going to multiply, and their offspring are all going to have that resistant trait. And then you've got a whole population of bacteria that are resistant, and it happens very quickly. So you can see evolution, that is evolution occurring. That's a change in a species over time. Insects, same thing with insects. It takes a little bit longer because their reproductive cycles are a little bit longer, but you can see insects evolving resistance to pesticides. Again, you have a population of insects living in a field of corn, for example, and a few of them will have this mutation that just randomly occurs, and it allow them to survive being sprayed with a pesticide. Well, the rest of the population dies off, and only those few insects can survive. So they're able to pass on that gene that prevents them from dying from this pesticide, and now you have an entire population of insects eventually that are going to be resistant to the pesticides. And then we have modeling natural selection with selective breeding to alter species traits. Humans have been doing this for hundreds, thousands of years. We've been breeding dogs for specific traits. The dog ancestor looked nothing like any of the modern dogs that we have now. And look at the variety in the species of canines that we have. You go from a Chihuahua to a Great Dane, and the differences are unbelievable, because there is no species on Earth that has such variety within them. Even humans don't have that much variety. It's amazing what you can do when you're controlling that breeding process. And then other observed examples of speciation. We've seen the Galapagos finches on how they evolved and created new species there. We've seen evolution occur with the rock pocket mice and the lava flats in the black mice that randomly had a mutation that allowed them to survive in certain areas. So there's a lot of those observed examples that show us that evolution is occurring all the time. Okay, here's some mistakes that people make when it comes to evolution. Stronger organisms are more fit than weak ones. Evolutionary fitness is not physical fitness. It doesn't have anything to do with strength, usually. Fitness is determined by who is better adapted to survive in a particular environment and who can pass on those genes. Stronger is not always better. There are many examples of species for whom it is better to be slow, weak, or stupid than fast, strong, or smart. It all depends on the environment that they're in. Another mistake, the organism evolved to live in its environment. The problem with that is that individual organisms do not evolve. Only a whole population or a whole species can evolve. Another mistake, the organism cannot adapt and it went extinct. Individual organisms just simply die. They can't go extinct. Only a whole species can go extinct. Here's another mistake. The bacteria became resistant to antibiotics when they were exposed to them. To evolve, variations have to exist in a species before the environment changes, so pre-adaptation. Bacteria that did not already have resistance to the antibiotics would die when they're exposed to them. A Chihuahua who is left out in the cold will not just grow long, warm fur, and a squirrel who plays in traffic will not just evolve automobile resistance. Okay, the variation has to be there beforehand. Here's another mistake. Giraffes got long necks because they needed them to eat the leaves at the tops of the trees. Species do not evolve traits because they need them. Life would be much better because then short-necked giraffes, they were never given long necks any more than slower antelopes are given speed when they're confronted by a predator. The reason there are no short-necked giraffes or slow antelope is that they were outcompeted by members of their species with more fit traits. So here's a better way to talk about giraffes. Giraffes evolved long necks because the ones with longer necks were better adapted to get food than the short-necked giraffes. Or you could say giraffes evolved long necks because more short-necked giraffes died and more long-necked giraffes lived and reproduced. Okay, let's take a look at one of the diagrams that you might see. So on the bottom, on the x-axis, you can see the amount of change, transitioning between different species. And then on the left, that's the one you want to pay attention to, is time. So at the bottom is a long time ago, at the top is like current time. And you can see that they all come from an original species, and the models might look a little different. They might look more V-shaped, or they might have more square branches. They'll call this first model, an example of gradualism, that everything is changing gradually. And then they'll call model 2 like punctuated equilibrium, because it'll be stable for a while and then all of a sudden you'll have brand new species coming about. But what these little dots are representing is a particular species, and then when they branch off into 2 or more, those are organisms. They're separate species, but they share that common ancestor. Same thing with on model 1. For example, you have this dot labeled A, and then you have B and C up here. Well, they are different species, even though they exist at the same time, but they evolved from the same common ancestor. And that's how you're going to take a look to see how closely related organisms are. And then we have this other chart. Again, you've got a long time ago at the bottom and present time at the top. When these dots like C and D they stop there in time, that means they went extinct. Those species no longer exist. Sometimes you'll see the same letter repeated throughout, and that means that it's able to survive through time. But all of the species except for J, K, and M have gone extinct. Every single one of these share A as a common ancestor. And they may ask, you might be asked a question, which 2 organisms are more closely related, O and P or P and M? And you would say O and P because they share a more recent common ancestor. P and M are related because they share F, but that happened a longer time ago. But N, it happened more recently, so O and P are more closely related. And then this is looking at fossil and the age of fossils. We know because of the principle of superposition, the rock layers towards the bottom are older than the ones on top. So if you find a fossil embedded in a lower layer, that fossil is older than the ones that come above it. So layer A is older than layer B. So relatively that B is a newer species. And this diagram is just kind of giving you the example of homologous parts on organisms, homologous structures. They all have similar bones, so they have, a humerus is located in the same place, the radius and the ulna is located in the same place. They look different, but that's because they have a different function. But because they look so similar, that's telling us that they have an ancestor that's related to all 3 of them. Even though they have different functions, one is for grasping, and one is for flying, one is for swimming, it's telling us that they are still closely related. And then looking at the evolution of the horse, they evolved from a tiny little, almost dog-sized ancestor. But I can tell you that all of these other species have gone extinct because they evolved into new species, and now horses are the current species in this line of descent. And that takes us to the end of evolution. You can now go complete your homework assignment.